How much does it actually cost to live in Portugal? I've been tracking my expenses for the last 5 years, and now I'm going to be sharing all that data with you so that you can see about how much you might spend living day to day in Portugal. Now, a couple of things you need to know before we dive into the numbers. I've been living in the Lisbon metropolitan area, meaning in the actual city of Lisbon and also south of Lisbon, closer to Setúbal. And that means that I've been living in the most expensive area in the country, arguably. If you're not going to be living in the Lisbon metropolitan area, or even Porto, if you're going to be living in smaller cities in the interior, you might be able to spend a little bit less than what I'm going to be sharing with you. However, I'm also a single person in a shared apartment. If you're planning on having your own apartment and not splitting the bills with somebody, if you have a family that you need to take care of, then you might have more expenses. I'm also not a big spender and I really try to watch my budget, hence why I have data on 5 years of my budget. I've been tracking this and I keep an eye on prices. But if you really like to shop or if there's something you like to do that is going to be potentially a big expense, you're definitely going to need to keep that in mind and think about my numbers and how it would look different in your life. And the numbers I'm going to be covering in this video are going to be monthly expenses based on 2023. Things have gone up in the last couple of years, at least on my expenses. These are the costs that I've spent recently, and I think they're the most accurate numbers I have to date. One thing I'm not going to be getting into in this video is the cost of my apartment rent, because I did a whole video on that. So if you haven't seen that, or if you want to go back to that, just click up here, or I'll leave a link in the description. Definitely check that out, because I not only go into how much I've spent over the last few years for you to see how things have changed, but I also did a live search so that you could see what kind of options were out there in the market currently. But to summarize, I spent about 500 euros renting a bedroom in a shared flat. Let's start off with something that's not super sexy, but something that everybody needs, which is bills and utilities like water, electricity, the internet, and phone service. Starting with electricity, the service provider that I've always had has been EDP. I know there are other service providers in Portugal, but they don't seem to be the ones that I have access to in my apartments, so I've always been with EDP. And I would imagine that different service providers, although they might vary, I don't know if they would vary that much. If you have another service provider that's not EDP for electricity, I'd love to know about it. Please tell me in the comments, because I have never heard of anyone having electricity through another company for a residential home. But I spend about 45 euros per month on electricity when you average it out over the year. And I do use some heating and air conditioning in my apartment, but not very much. Okay, now water is billed through the municipal. So the city basically charges you for water. And I've been spending about 15 euros per month on water, which I actually think is a lot considering that I share an apartment. That's much more that I've been spending here in Lisbon than I spent in Pinhal Novo, which was about half that. I'm not really too sure why, but yeah, I think water is always billed through the city because that's how it's always been for me. And I spent about 15 euros on it. Okay, now Wi-Fi, which is pretty much essential these days. I don't know how I would live without Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is really hard to get by itself. I've never actually seen an offer for just Wi-Fi. It's usually in a bundle like cable and Wi-Fi together. There are several companies, but mostly I've used Vodafone, and that's been around 40 euros per month. But keep in mind, it does depend on, the speed of Wi-Fi you want, if you have any extra channels and all that stuff. But I would say for a pretty basic package from Vodafone, I spent 40 euros per month on that. And then my phone bill. So it's varied a bit over the last few years, but in 2023, I signed a 2-year contract with Vodafone for my cell phone, and it's around 25 euros for unlimited data, which is kind of a steal. I would look out for some good deals on that. But yeah, I spent about 25 euros a month just for my Vodafone plan to have my Portuguese phone number. That being said, because I also have a life in America and things to deal with in America, I do keep an American phone number. If you want me to go into porting telephone numbers and all that stuff, I can definitely do a video on it for you. But I spend around 5 euros a month just having that phone number available and for some limited texting and calling. And so that brings our total for the utilities up to 130 euros per month. Okay, so probably you don't want to sit in your apartment all day, especially if you move to a new country, you want to get around. So let's talk about transportation. I use public transportation a lot here. You have two options in Lisbon for a pass, where you can basically get a pass to go around all inside the city center of Lisbon for 30 euros a month. But I usually opt for the 40 euro a month pass, because for just 10 more euros, I can get around the entire district of Lisbon and Setúbal, essentially, because it's a pass for the entire Lisbon metropolitan area. That pass is great because you can see a lot more things around Lisbon and not just inside of Lisbon. And I just happen to have friends on both sides of the river, so it's very convenient for that. I do very rarely use Ubers, but not enough to really feel like I need to include it here. And the prices just vary on the time of day and all that stuff. But keep in mind that you may need a little extra for Ubers if you don't have your own car. Now, I do have a car, but I'm not going to get into the expenses of that because many people don't have cars, especially if you're living in the city center, and there's a lot to get into with that. But I am planning on doing a video on cars, so let me know all your questions about that in the comments, and I'll make sure to address those in the video if I can. But yeah, so my whole public transportation cost is just 40 euros a month. Now, before we dive into the rest of the living expenses, and believe me, you're going to want to stick around, there's some interesting stuff in there. Let me just introduce myself. I'm Julia. I've been living in Portugal since 2019, and I make content to introduce you to Portugal and help you navigate life and travel here. And since I do make all this content at no cost to you, I just ask that you do me a quick favor and give this video a like and subscribe to my channel to make sure that you get notified when new stuff comes out. Now let's get back to our living expenses. Healthcare costs. Now, this is one of the reasons that a lot of Americans will quote that got factored into their move to Europe or to Portugal, because healthcare costs are extreme in the United States. So there is a public healthcare system in Portugal, but it can sometimes be difficult to get appointments and access certain things. And for that reason, and because when I first moved here, I could not speak Portuguese well enough to navigate through the public healthcare system, I got private healthcare insurance. And that is about 25 euros per month for me. But keep in mind, it's dependent on age and if you have any other pre-existing conditions. So definitely need to check what your personal quote would be for that one. And then the insurance doesn't cover everything. So there are still medication costs and certain co-pays for doctor visits. And I spend about 20 euros per month on that. There are things that are not covered by healthcare insurance. Stuff like mental health care is not always covered by insurance. I'm not really familiar with how vision's covered. Dental is not part of my insurance plan. So there are other things to consider outside of that. But my typical health insurance cost per month and doctor visit plus medication averaged out over the year comes to about 45 euros per month. Okay, food, obviously a necessity, and we don't want to miss out on all the wonderful food in Portugal. So there's two things that I consider in this category, which is groceries to cook food and then going out to eat. For groceries, I'm a single person and I do cook most of my meals. I spend about 200 euros on groceries per month. That obviously depends on what you're buying. This has gone up a lot in the last few years, but yeah, that's about what I'm spending, and I'm not buying anything extravagant. Now, I can't cook every meal. I get tired. I also want to have a social life and go experience the wonderful cooking here in Portugal. It's definitely one of my favorite things about Portugal. So I do go out to eat around like once to twice per week, and occasionally like a cafe for a pastry and a coffee or something like that. And I do order in occasionally when I'm just too tired to cook, not feeling well or whatever. And so for all of that, I spent around 200 euros on eating out / ordering in. I do think that's very expensive. I think it's gotten expensive to eat out in Lisbon. There are definitely a variety of price options. I don't really go to anywhere that I would consider like a very high budget, high end restaurant on a typical night out, but yeah, I do end up spending about 200 euros a month on food outside of the home. Okay, so housing, utilities, transportation, healthcare, and food. Those are non-negotiables. But I would say nearly every person wants to have a little bit more to their life. Maybe you travel, maybe you read, maybe you have a sport that you play, some kind of hobby, maybe you like to go shopping, whatever these extra things are, you're gonna need just at least a little bit more cash in order to have kind of a full life. And some of these things may cost way different than they did where you came from. So you're definitely gonna have to look up the specifics on this one. But my additional expenses include things like streaming services, haircuts, when I need to get new clothes, other personal items, things for around the house, if something breaks and I need to fix it. I do play paddle occasionally, things like that. And for all of that, I spend around 200 euros per month. And that brings us to a grand total of around 1,300 euros, which is kind of a lot on a Portuguese salary, but it just depends on where your income's coming from, what you're getting paid, and of course, all the factors I mentioned before. Are you single? Are you living with someone? Do you have a family? Do you have a second income? I didn't include travel at all in this budget, but if you've moved here from another country, you are probably going to need a travel budget if you want to see your friends and family. And if you're like me and you have to travel to the States, can be a lot that you need to save up monthly to make sure that you can still see your friends and family. So don't forget to budget that in when considering how much it'll cost for you to live in Portugal. And then you'll also want money for, maybe you want to take a trip. You're living in Europe. It's so easy to get around to other countries. Maybe you're going to want to go see them. Maybe you're going to want to see the museums here. Maybe you're going to want to, travel within Portugal and see the different parts of the country, do a wine tasting. I don't know. Stuff comes up, not just fun stuff, but other things that you weren't expecting to have to pay for. And so you're definitely going to want to have some extra cash on hand. And also the price of things can go up. What do you think about these costs? Do you think that Portugal is in fact affordable to live in? Do you think this is very expensive? Personally, I'm a little bit concerned because on a Portuguese salary, this is getting really tight for a lot of people. Do you think Portugal's got more expensive in recent years? Leave all that in the comments. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions about how much something costs that I didn't cover, leave that in the comments and I'll try to get a good answer for you. Thanks for watching and see you next time.